Hi, this is Tanya Gupta, and today I'll be taking a session on functions in C++. Now, before jumping into the session or the concept, here you see the highlighted points which we will be discussing in today's session. First is what are functions, and then we'll discuss about why do we need functions, and then we'll discuss a real life example to understand functions and to relate functions with the real life world. And then we'll discuss the prototype of a function, how the blueprint of a function looks like in any programming language. And then I'll implement two functions for you in C++ to get an idea how functions are actually coded in C++. And then at the end, we'll summarize all these points once again. And so, yeah, this will be the flow of today's session. So let's get started. Now, what are functions? Function is basically a block of code that performs a certain task. You can say that whenever a call to a function is made, the block of the code or the body of the function gets executed. So this is as simple as that. Function is a block of code or a piece of code that gets executed whenever a call to that function is made. Now, whenever we understand about any new concept, the first thing that should come into our mind is why do we even need to use functions? Why? What's the importance of using functions? What are the benefits that functions provide us? So to answer this question, I'll break this answer in two parts. First, functions make your code modular. Now, what do you mean by the modularity of the code? Means it breaks a large piece of code into smaller chunks, which are much easier to read, maintain, extend, bug fix, and for the other person to read your code. So functions improve the readability of the code, maintainability of the code, extendability of the code. It eases the process of bug fixing. It makes it very easier for other person to read your code, and it also makes easier for yourself, to read the code in future. And the second point would be functions avoid duplicacy in the code. Now, what do you mean by it? Suppose you have 10,000 lines of code which provides a certain functionality and which you need at many points of times while writing a code. So you won't be writing those 10,000 of lines again and again because it is next to impossible, right? Every time you need that functionality to be executed, you won't write those 10,000 of lines again and again, which it makes your code very complex and it's very non-feasible for the developer to do. So here's where functions come into the picture. What you do is that you define that 10,000 lines of code inside a function once, and then whenever you want to use that in your code, wherever you want, you just make a call to that function and that block of code will get executed. So it saves developers time and effort, and it makes your code much simpler. So functions avoid duplicacy in the code, and it also facilitates the code reusage. You are reusing a certain set of code again and again by just making a function call to them. So these are the benefits that functions provide, and in software development, when you're a software engineer, it is very much expected and recommended out of you that you use functions in your coding part so that your code becomes very much modular and simpler. And so now let's just discuss about the real life example of functions. Now to discuss that, let's take an example of a car. Okay. So this is our car. And we all know that there are three mechanisms or three things that are fitted in every car. First is clutch, brake, and accelerator. Okay, so this car you can think of think of it as a real life entity. It can be called as an object, which has three functions. Now, whenever a driver sits in the car and presses the brake, it means you can imagine it as analogous to calling the brake function. And whenever he presses the brake, the mechanism behind the brake or the body of the brake function gets called up and it is executed. So similar to clutch and accelerator. Okay. So whenever a person sits inside the car, he is exposed to these functions, and whenever he calls up any functions or press anything out of these three, he is calling that function and the body behind that function will be called up. So with this example, you can relate functions, how functions are used in real life as well, right? So this was an example to kind of give you an idea of how you can relate or think of functions with the real life examples. Now let's move on to discussing the prototype of a function, how a general prototype of a function looks like. It is not specific to the C++. The prototypes remains the same for every function in every programming language. So now for prototype of a function has a return type, then it has a name. Let's say this is the name, and then it has a list of arguments. Which gets passed as the input arguments, and then it has a body, some lines of code which are defined inside the function, which is known as the body of function. Okay, so now this function can be split into two parts. This part of having a return type, the function name, and the list of arguments, this is known as the declaration of a function. Right, and this part is known as definition of a function. Okay, so now how this function is called up, let's say in main method. So let's say this is our main method. So inside the main method, let's say we have two lines. In first line, we are calling up this function with its name, function name, and pass the list of arguments. Right? So this is how we call the function. And in the second line, let's say we print out something. So now, whenever this function is called, the control of the program goes to the body of the function, and whenever the body of the function has completed its execution, the control reaches back to the next line where the function was called. So the control reaches back to this cout line. So this is how the flow of function calls and the program control happens whenever a function is called. So this is the prototype of a function which is generally followed in every language. Now let's jump on to coding this function, coding two basic functions as an example in C++. So I'll move quickly to an editor. And let's say first I write a greet function, a simple greet function. So my greet function, let's see. Okay, so my greet function, let's say it doesn't have any return type, it doesn't return anything, and its name is greet, and it has empty list of arguments. So let's say the body of the function goes like, hi, have a nice day. So this is the body of the function, which is also known as the definition of the function, and this part is the declaration of function. Okay, now how do we call this function in the main method? We just call it by the name and pass the list of arguments. Since it is empty, we'll pass nothing. So this is how the function is called. And let's say in another line, we print something like bye. So now what should happen is that whenever the greet function is called, the control goes to the definition of the function, So it will get printed as hi, have a nice day. And then the controller of the program reaches back to the next line, which is this, and the bye will get printed. So let's just save this program and let's compile this and let's execute this now. Okay, so we are getting output as hi, have a nice day, and bye. Now let's quickly implement one another simple function, which is addition function, which sums two numbers when given as an input, right? So here the list of arguments was empty, but in addition function, we'll have some list of arguments. So let's say the return type is int because it will return the sum of the two numbers. And then function name is addition. And then let's say we have two numbers here. Okay. And then let's say we write the body of the function, which will be returning this sum of two numbers. And then let's just remove these lines of code and call that function. For that, first we need the inputs. And then let's say we take this as input from the users. And we pass these inputs as arguments in the function. So let's say we call this function and we pass these arguments. And let's say this will return the sum. So let's say we print that sum. Okay, so let's just save it and let's try to run it. Okay, let's give user input as 2, then 8. Okay, 10 is returning. So it is adding up these two user inputs. So this is how functions are actually coded in C++. This is the actual coding part where we have the return type of the function, function name, and the list of arguments and the body of the function. And then we call it by its name and the list of arguments. Okay, now let's summarize what all we discussed in this session is. First, we discussed about what are functions. Functions are a block of code that performs a certain task. And then we discussed about why functions are important. And then we also discussed a real life example to get you an idea that how you can relate functions to the real life scenario. We also discussed about the prototype of a function, which remains the same in every programming language. And then we also implemented two simple functions in C++ to get to know how actually the coding part is done for the functions. So this brings us to the end of the session. I hope this session was useful to you. Thank you and have a nice day.